Educational organization whose purpose is to preserve and advance the knowledge of the world's maritime heritage, focusing on that of Sitka and Southeast Alaska. And I think we are really privileged to have a distinguished panel. And what I'll do now is introduce them by name, and they can give you a little wave. And then we're going to start out with Fred Hope, who's going to give about a 5-minute overview of what a cannery is. And so without further ado, tonight, our panel members are Bob DeArmond.
Bill.
That's why they invited me. Everybody on the panel will feel comfortable because I'll stick my foot in the mouth right in the beginning. Bob DeArmond.
Again.
To be further known as Bill. Over on our left, and on my immediate right, Nels Lawson. And next to him, Irene Vaden. And then we go Mildred Layton, John Nielsen, Fred Hope, and Lisa Killinger. Oh, I'm sorry. Florence Donnelly. And after stumbling through that, I'm sure Fred Hope will do a really good job describing what a cannery is. And Fred, and for the rest of the panel members, we have a lot of material to cover tonight. And I've been asked by the organizers to have about a 5-minute limit on each of the panel members, and then after everybody, and I guess we have Lisa Killinger. Thank you. Sarah Jordan has consented to raise a little red cloth when about 5 minutes are up. And after about a minute of raising that cloth, we don't want to know what happens next. So, anyway, without further ado, Fred, would you start us off with a little bit about Cannery Life?
Hello, my name is Fred Hope, and we want to talk about Cannery Life. In the beginning, there was a cannery in Sitka and a cannery in Kloak. And from there on, it spread all over Alaska, but mostly in southeast at the beginning. What I want to say is that a cannery consisted of a building that was held up by pilings, and it was out in the bay. And there was a close, reliable source of fresh water nearby. There was a generator to produce electricity and a furnace to produce steam for cooking. What you had at the first building was an elevator that went down into the bay. And there the boats, usually tenders, but sometimes the fishing boats themselves, came to that elevator and they unloaded their fish there. And they the elevator took it up to the bins. There was anywhere from 4 to 6 bins up on top. And they were segregated into dog salmon, pink salmon, cohos, and once in a while king salmon, but hardly ever. But from there, it went into the slimer line, the heading machine, the gutting machine. You had all these different buildings in a cannery. Most of them were empty warehouses. And at the beginning, the seiners, which was the people that went out and caught the fish, would hang their seines there. At the beginning, we had cotton seines, and they had to be redone all the time. It's not like today where you have nylon seines and they hardly need any attention. But every spring, you had crews of men working on their gear, and they stretched the seine out, and they made it so that the cork line was longer than the lead line, so that it made sort of a bow effect when the seine was in use, and it captured the fish, kept them from going underneath the lead line. You had different crews at different occasions. The Chinese were the first ones to come into Alaska, and it appears that there was a law being broken at the time, so they quit using Chinese. Right after that, we had Filipinos that came into the canneries, and the native people were here, and the whites were here, and even back then we had segregation. The whites had their own buildings, and the Indians had their own house. What we had was a whole series of houses, and the people moved into those houses, and usually they came from different areas. And when they left Sitka, it was like a big celebration. Everybody was so happy to be going to the canneries. Everybody was yelling and singing and having a good time. What you did once you got to the cannery was you set up house, and you took care of your own personal family and your belongings. You were assigned a house, and the Filipinos had a bunkhouse, what they called a bunkhouse, and it was a huge building, and it was segregated into small rooms where they could set up their bunks. Then you had a mess hall. Then you had a dining room. You had airplane floats. You had fuel docks. It was almost like a little city. And once you got into town, you found out right away where everything was, and the main place that you were concerned about was the office. The office is where you went to draw money, and draw money was a term that meant you had to go to borrow money on your future earnings. And everybody knew where the office was right away, and you knew who the superintendent was right away. Like in Todd Cannery, which is in Peril Straits, Nick Best was the main man there. He was the superintendent. And in Sitka, Lawrence Freeberg was the main man. And in Chatham, we had several different supervisors there, and I can't remember one right now. Maybe Herman can name it.
John Likeness.
John Likeness. I knew he had a good name. Thank you. And you had all these different buildings, and they had different functions. You had an area where you made boxes. You had an area where you opened cans. You put one lid on them, and that can was sent down to the first floor, and it was there that the cut up salmon was put into each can. Each can was designated to hold 1 pound. And then you had a series of women looking at each can to make sure it was full. If it was short a couple slices, they added those slices to that can. And then it could be sent into to have the lid put on it. After the lid was put on it, then it went into a tray. Several trays were put into the boiler. I would estimate about 12 trays were put in there. And they were slid into the boiler room on a rail. And the door was shut behind them, and they were cooked. I'm not sure how long they cooked them, but it was cooked, and then after a certain time it was extracted, and it was put outside in the hallway where it was cooled. And when it was cooling, you could hear the cans popping. You had a grocery store, and in them days you pretty much lived on fish, but there was other things that you could buy at the grocery store, and the guys were mainly concerned about cigarettes. And all these things you could charge, but most of the time they'd rather see cash. That pretty much covers what I remember of the cannery. If anybody else has anything to add to it, I'll appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. I thought we'd go right now for a historical perspective on the Cannery Life to Bill DeArmond. You want to turn your mic on?
I thought I did.
Oh, there you go. Great.
Okay, is it going now? Okay, it must be. I can hear myself. Historical perspective, I don't know too much about that. Fred already mentioned the first one of the first two canneries in Alaska was put in out at Old Sitka in 1878. It only ran for 2 years. It never made money, and finally the San Francisco people who built it just abandoned it, and Sheldon Jackson went out there and scavenged the lumber to build the school. But of course that was all complete hand operation. They even still soldered the cans by hand. And then Sitka didn't get another cannery till Pyramid Cannery down there. It's still there. It was built in 1918, and there were a couple of other small canneries over the years here too. My own first connection with canneries was in Pelican. My father was Bob DeArmond, was one of the founders of Pelican. He was one of the crew that went out there with Cannon in the spring of 1938, the year I was born, to build a cold storage and start a town out there. Because there was more and more troll and halibut fishing up that way at that time, and there was no cold storage anywhere near there. So that was why Pelican was built. It wasn't originally intended to have a cannery at Pelican, just a cold storage and quite a big mild cure operation for troll-caught kings, which was still a big business in those days, supplying the New York delis with locks. But then in the spring of 1940, the big cannery at Port Alpha burned. That was a beautiful cannery. I've seen pictures of it. I don't remember it. But so there was no cannery up anywhere around there then. The nearest ones were Hoonah and Excursion Inlet and Sitka. So they, for the 1940 season, they put in an emergency canning line on the floor of the warehouse in the cold storage in Pelican. And just about everybody in town, literally, which of course wasn't very many people, but everybody, including both of my parents, turned out to work on that cannery line. Now, the following year, 41, I believe, they built the cannery building. You can see it in the picture back there. It's just down the inlet from the cold storage. It was never a big cannery. Pelican Cannery was just one line, but I used to get to go in there when I was a kid, and that was the most exciting place in town. Even more so than the sawmill and the cooper shop and Old George's boat shop, because all the noise and the whirling machinery and the shiny cans flying along, and all the women with their bright head scarves working away and still managed to talk full tilt at the same time, and the roar of the steam going in and out of the retorts and the doors clanging. It was I used to just burst out yelling myself to add to the noise. It was such an exciting place. The Pelican Cannery ran until 1959. That was the year Alaska became a state. And of course, the first thing they did was outlaw fish traps, which had a lot of, I think, was a short-sighted, emotional, and poorly thought-out decision. It tore the heart out of the canned salmon industry. It didn't need to have been done that way, but most of the big canneries just shut down at that time and destroyed the livelihoods of an awful lot of people. The Pelican Cannery shut down. I believe Whiz bought the machinery and moved it to Tyee, and it ran a couple of times. It ran that down there for a while, but that was the end of canning in Pelican. But a big part of the cannery life, which hasn't been mentioned yet, was two big parts that were an integral part of it, were the traps and the tenders. The big canneries depended on the traps, and Nacat and Libby and so forth. And when traps were outlawed, they just shut down and sold off their operations and shut them down. And of course that point can still be debated, but the trap-caught salmon were a higher quality than the seine-caught fish. They used to advertise right on the labels, guaranteed genuine Alaska trap-caught salmon. they didn't get handled as much, and they didn't get net damaged as much. But when I was a little older and we lived in Ketchikan, I got to go out on the trap tender, so I'm probably one of not too many people still around who got to go go out on the trap tenders on a working salmon trap and see the trap being lifted, which was a fascinating operation, getting the salmon out of the trap and into the tenders or into the tenders and the scows. It's a way of life that has completely vanished now. And of course, the tender fleet, there were hundreds of trap tenders around, and they were interesting vessels, usually very heavily built because they'd really take a pounding up against the trap logs, and those traps had to be lifted whatever the weather was. And there are still a few of them around. The old St. Lazaria was a good example of the bigger tenders, and there's still a few others you see around here during the herring season. The Rowetta and the Amelie I've seen. The Rowetta was also a mail boat. But a few of the old tenders left around. It was a very different life in southeast Alaska in those days. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Yake. I thought we'd go right now to a different perspective from Florence Donnelly.
My first experience with the cannery was in 1927 in Haines, Alaska. I did work in the cannery. I was too young then to work there, but I'd go out there every Sunday, and all the workers would come, and I'd bring the organ to play for them, but I didn't sing humpback salmon at that time. If I had it available, I would have sang it to them, but I went out with a minister, and our church represented every Sunday at the cannery, and that was a happy bunch of people. They enjoyed their work. They had a lot of laughter, and it wasn't work for them. It was more play time. And I remember my family being involved, working for the cannery. They slept in tents. Some of them slept in tents. Some had bunkhouses, but most of them had tents at that time. It was about, let's see how many miles out of town. It must have been around 15 miles out of Haines. Maybe I'm just guessing too much. But my next experience with the cannery was here in Sitka. I was at Sheldon Jackson School, came from Haines to Sheldon Jackson, and I worked in the cannery. Then in 1929 was my first experience working in the cannery for 25 cents an hour. And my tuition was $50 a year at that time. So I didn't have much money left, by the time. Money didn't stretch that. It was available to us to work there at the time. We were fortunate. We had a job. My job at the time was to stack cans way up in above deck, and we packed the cases of empty cans that were ready for filling. I never did work with the fish, but I worked with the cans, and I was trying to place who was available who's alive at that time. I think about the oldest one alive that worked in the cannery at that time. But I enjoyed it, and we all had fun. I was trying to think of ways that people survived during that time, was Depression times, and we were all happy. We didn't know any other way. We were happy as a people, no income tax. We only had one cop here in town. We behaved ourselves, and it just seemed like it was just a different time. And when we tell our children about our times years ago, they don't believe us. They don't. is that all you made? And then we went last summer to Chatham, and Jim Case is the one that was head of this program, and we went out there to see the old cannery, which was still, buildings were still up, but I never had any dealings at that cannery. But then I worked out at Goddard Hot Springs when it was working for tourism in 1930-something. And I enjoyed my work in the old days. I never did work. I was a housewife, but I enjoyed doing volunteer work. And the cannery, if you have any questions you'd like to ask, I'll answer if it's available.
Yake. Florence. And we will have a period of questions after everybody makes a presentation.
Okay.
And what I'd like to do now is a different part of the Cannery Life. A part that I was really experienced with was, of course, the fishing part of it. And John Nielsen has told me that he was involved in that. And so now we'll find out if that's true, John.
I didn't lie to you. Yes, my name is John Nielsen. My childhood days, my brother and I grew up in Chatham, Alaska. We didn't go fishing right away because we were too young. It was in 1942 when we first went to Chatham. My dad fished with Charlie Daniels Sr. on the Freddie II company boat. And the year after that, my dad became a skipper of his own boat on another company boat, the Sockeye King. And then later in the years, my dad skippered the Exhibit, another company boat. And their skippers were over there where there's another company boat named Elmo. It was run by Charlie Joseph Sr. And later in the years, Charlie Dan had a boat built by Andrew Hope, the Empress. His grandchildren are over here. They'll tell you about that. But I want to tell you the years of the time we went fishing. My brother was a boat cook because he was a dishwasher on the boat. Too young to draw any wages, but I was pretty young myself, just drawing only a half share because I couldn't draw a full share because I wasn't old enough. But I did a lot of fishing with my dad and a lot of other people. The cannery is owned by New England Fish Company, which there's many of them in Alaska. I fished for 3 different New England companies. One is in Steamboat Bay, Chatham, Alaska, and up in Orca, Cordova. So I've crossed the Gulf a few times on the fishing boats, purse seining, halibut fishing, and I trolled a lot with my dad during the war. But
John, if I could ask you, seining then was a lot different than it is now. Were you seining before the advent of the power block when you just had the roller?
I was going to come to that.
Okay, great.
That's when I quit fishing. So, in the years 1945, we were fishing in Snitson Cove on the Exhibit. My brother was on the skiff, and this was in June, I believe. And all the horns and the guns were blowing off from all the same boats. And word came that the BJ Day I had three brothers in the service. They did not fish on the same boat until after they came back from service. Of course, I was the big boy in the family, staying at home. I was born in 1929 when Florence was working full time.
I didn't hear him. But
So we, New England Fish Company was run by the company, and they had traps, tender, and power scows, and rigging scows, but we'd stay in all the operation on the rigging scows and the tenders rigging up the traps, and they tow them to the sites where they set up traps. And one trap in particular was set up there where Icy Queen is now. They named that the $1 Million Trap. That used to bring in the most fish to the company. And like you say, abolishment came in the late 50s, but I wasn't purse seining then. I fished up until 52 for Pyramid Company. I fished halibut with my Uncle John Young on the Patricia May, halibut, and then purse seine. And before that, I fished with Paul Liberts on the Invader at Steamboat Bay. And they had company boats on there, the Cape Ulitka, Chinook. I forgot the other one. There was one more. And the majority of them fishermen there were the Hamilton brothers. Captain George Hamilton, Sr., Junior, Gilbert, Harry, Don, Franklin, Baby George.
Okay, John. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. I thought we'd go to a different perspective, right from the Cannery Life with Mildred Layton.
Mm-hmm.
Can you all hear me?
Nope.
Yes, wonderful. My experience came from Chatham, Alaska, which was run by New England Fish Company at the time. My mom and dad took all of us girls there during the summer, and we thought this was just our playground while they went and worked in the cannery. One particular incident I remember of our fun times there was we had this float that launched the seaplanes and, you know, brought them in. And my sister and I we weren't allowed to play on that float, but it just so happened that everybody was working that day, so her and I were sitting on the dock, on the float, I mean, and she got mischievous and she reached down and she started splashing water on me. And I told her to knock it off. In my little baby language, I had to be all about 5 or 6 years old, and she kept it up. So I lost my temper, and I leaped up, and I went over to her, and I pushed her. We had a high tide at that time, and she went right over the side, and she sunk right down to the bottom and sat there. Just sat there at the bottom, and I'm looking over the edge at her, and I didn't know what to do. And she sat there for, I don't know how long, and finally she bobbed to the surface. And it just was a really lucky thing. My father was walking by on the boardwalks at the time, and he saw me do what I did. And so he came running down and reached out and yanked her out of the water and saved her life. And I went running home. I knew I was really going to get whipped badly as young as I was. but he didn't whip me, thank goodness. That was my really young life there. A lot of the times we just spent our time exploring the beaches and picking up all the rocks, picking berries, using any little receptacle we could find to make mud pies, which we decorated with salmonberry flowers, and we said that they were the finest ever made in the world, and all kinds of games were invented by each and every one of us. What? Oh, the crocheting part. I don't remember that too much, but we used to go and visit our neighbors, and some of them, they introduced us to some tropical fish. We had never ever heard of tropical fish. This was a big cannery. This lady had brought her tropical fish with her, and they were guppies. And they had 1 million babies in this one tank. And we were really fascinated with her, and even though we did not know this lady, we would go and visit her because we wanted to see her guppies. Okay, that was one story. Now, as I grew older and I reached the age of 14, my mother sent me over to Chatham to stay with my Aunt Martha Sitka. My Aunt Martha put me to work up in the can loft. And they have this great big huge noisy machine. You can't hear yourself talk, much less think. And it was my responsibility to lift the lids for the cans and put it in my hand and look for warped ones. And I was supposed to pull those out and throw them away before I put it into the machine. And these lids are going down all the time as the cans are being lidded. Well, as 14 years old go, you drift off into, dreamland. So I'm just going like this, and I'm lost in another world. And my machine is shut down and I snap out of my dream. And here is my boss. And he is a great, big, huge Norwegian man with wild white hair.
His name was
And
George.
I looked at him with great big huge eyes, and he says, "You're not paying attention to what you're doing." He pointed to behind my machine, and there was this huge stack of lids that had been spit out of the machine because it was getting all the bent ones, so everything after the bent one went on the floor. Well, I didn't lose my job because my aunt was forewoman. And so luckily I got to work out through the entire season, and I felt really proud that I had gotten a check at the end of the summer, but during the summer working, we never thought of money. It was just all fun. So when the check came at the end of the summer, we were really delighted to have that. And that went to the Sears Roebuck catalog for material, so we could start sewing our skirts for school and buying sweaters to go with the skirts. And I turned this whole story business over to my sister, Aileen.
Irene?
It was really nice to hear what other people had to say about the cannery and to explain it.
Doesn't seem
Oh,
to
yeah.
do anything.
Okay. I said it was really nice to hear what these other people had to say first, for me to renew myself again on the past, and it was delightful, and it brought back fond memories. And my mother and father had 4 daughters. There were no boys in the family. When we went to Chatham, we had to run. We didn't work. We didn't do a lick of work, I don't think, as children. And like Red says, we played on the float where we weren't supposed to. We went down past the warehouses, and we'd hear popping of cans. We had no idea what that was, but we'd hear the cans cooling off. We'd go by the generators to the store, and go into the store and get whatever we wanted to, and continued, I guess, playing. And the women would work hours upon hours, and then on the weekend it was wash day, and there was no griping. I have an automatic washer and dryer and everything. I mean, it all but fails for me. But those ladies were happy ladies, and they scrubbed on a scrub board. And so all day long in the wash house, the ladies would be there talking and laughing and scrubbing our jeans. My mother would scrub our jeans that we laid in the mud in and so forth. And so that was a wonderful part. And on certain parts of the summer, we'd have a missionary boat that would come into Chatham, and all of us kids would trace down to an empty cabin to have Sunday school service and church service and so forth. And and we were fearless of any bears. There was no bears that I can recollect that walked around Chatham. People said they spotted it, but we kids never did. And we would go up to the dam and pick berries and hoot and howl all the way up. And of course, you know, that was dangerous going up there by ourselves. But we were fearless, and we'd take company boats, and we'd go row across the channel, just like Sitka, you see going up further than Maritime, I'd say, maybe out to the islands out here. And we'd go to a lagoon, and then we'd start rowing back. All we wanted to do was hit the lagoon, and then we'd turn back with a company boat. And on the way back, we saw a blonde bear. We were told that bears can swim faster than a boat. So we rowed very gently, very quietly, and I think there was 4 of us in the boat, and watched the bear eat on the shore. And us kids in the boat were quiet and rowed very gently. And after a certain length of time, we continued normal rowing and talking and so forth. But that was our experience as children. My sister Betty was the fearless one, and my father would take his cabin cruiser and dock on the float plane. And this one day she got a grand idea that we would take my dad's boat and take it to the main dock and tie it up for him, because she knew how to do it. So she invited me, and she invited my cousin. And we got into the middle of the bay, and the boat quit. And there was nothing we could do about it. And everybody in the Cannery seemed to know that we were stuck out there. And we were all quarreling with each other on the boat because we didn't know what was the matter. Well, my cousin Gil came and with his inboard or outboard or whatever it's called, and towed us in. Well, we were all frightened that we were really in big trouble, so we ran home. And Chatham has benches. You have one great big long table like this, and then benches on each side to sit down. So we stacked that up like ladders, climbed that up, and climbed up into the attic. And my mother had dried apricots and apples and raisins and nuts and so forth stored up there. Well, us kids were going to live off the dried fruit up there. Well, time went by, and pretty soon we became bored with the idea, and we finally came down. And when my mom and dad finally came home from work, my father says, "You only did one thing wrong." He says, "You forgot to turn the gas on." So our experience was just so wonderful in Chatham, and I would tell such wonderful stories to my daughters of Chatham that I have a granddaughter that's sitting amid you, and her name is Chatham. She named her Chatham after my wonderful stories. If Chatham will stand for a second. And then through the years, it was finally our turn to work in the cannery. And my mom sent us over, and I was so upset because Midge got the cans. I forget what Betty got, but I got the sliming department. That was such a horrible name, and, you know, slime. And I was geared up for that. And I remember the fish coming through on a belt. and they're telling us to put it into your bin and to open it up, make sure it's clean. If there's anything residue inside, you take it out and then throw it back up on the conveyor belt. Well, as I was cleaning, I felt a fish gut slapped across my chest, and I was ever so surprised. And this woman says, "You will clean that over again." And at that time, I was so timid, you know, and I'm looking down and, you know, cleaned my fish over again and put it back up. Well, before you know it, she slapped another one across another woman's chest, because they're standing at the conveyor belt, you know, and they're almost chest high anyway. And the woman slapped the fish back at her. And I've never seen such behavior in my life. And so as we were in the cannery, Alaska became a state. I was so upset because my mother had allowed us to fly down to California to see my eldest sister. Then went from California, we flew up to Chatham, and we worked there. Well, my sister got all the glory in California, and their plane flew into Texas. And here I was stuck in Chatham, and we heard that there was all kinds of dancing in the street in Sitka with bonfires in the street and so forth. And here I was in Chatham. Any other time, Chatham would have been the most marvelous place, but because there was celebration time and Alaska was a state, I felt left out. But we could go on and on all night with these stories.
Well, yucky. Thank you, Irene. I wanted to ask Nels Lawson to add his perspective to what's turning out to be a wonderful variety of experiences on the Cannery Life. Nels?
Thank you, Eric. My name is Nels Lawson. I was born, am I on? Should be on now.
Speak first.
Yep. Are you on? Start, Nels.
My name is Nels Lawson. I was born in 1939 in Juneau, Alaska. My experience with the cannery is both as a child and a young adult. In my very early years, my family lived in two places. They lived in Douglas, the old village of Douglas. Sometimes we lived in Hoona. During the summer months, those that were, when it came time for the salmon season to begin, the young men, if they weren't old enough to go fishing, they went along with the ladies while the ladies were working in the cannery. Those were my early years, went along with the ladies and while they were working in the cannery. As I remember, like many of these stories, those were free times and fun times. I believe it was in the Hoona Cannery that when we went there to work in the cannery, we lived in tents. So during the day when the salmon were running and all those that were able to work were in the cannery, the young folks were pretty much left to their own devices. As I remember those times, there were varying ages of people or young folks that were left in the tent. Now those that were older had the responsibility of trying to keep track of the younger folks. And at that time I was one of the younger folks, so it was a little difficult to keep track of. There was a lot of wandering around, a lot of exploring. Just those times were just hard to describe. But they're free times. It seems like there were no restrictions. You could go pretty much anywhere you wanted. I don't remember any spankings. even if I did things that I wasn't supposed to do, there were no spankings. Basically, we were just told you ought not do that again. If you do that again, you might get hurt. After, I believe it was in about 1944, when my mother got TB, she ended up here in the hospital for a year. So when my mother was one of the lucky ones that got well. So when she got well, my dad acquired a job working for the hospital. So he decided to keep the job, and then we all moved here, and we grew up in a place that we remember as Millerville. So I was still too young to go fishing, but however, my mother and my grandmother worked at Pyramid Fisheries. One thing that my grandmother used to do, I remember quite well, is when the salmon were going through the chink, they called it the chink, it would cut off what they called the collar, and they would throw that part away. My grandmother and my mother would gather up all those collars and bring them home and put them in big barrels and salt them, and we would enjoy that all winter. The best part of the salmon, by the way. When I became old enough to go fishing, I went fishing with my uncle, Bill Peters. Spent a number of years fishing with him. Now, one of the questions that was asked here about before the power block. Before the power block, the seine was pulled onto the boat by hand. They had on the back of all the seiners, they had what they called a turntable. And you would pile the seine on that, and on one part of the turntable they had a roller. So the roller would be turned to the stern of the boat after the net was piled, and it would be ready to let go. So once you would let it go and it would run over the roller, then you'd close the set, then you'd put your turntable the right way, and then 4 to 5 men would pull the seine aboard the boat by hand. When the power block came along, it was almost no comparison. I saw the red flag go up. So my uncle never gave me the red flag. But one of the other things we did in commercial fisheries that the canneries were used for before the season started, there was a lot of maintenance work you needed to do on the seine. Sometimes you had to make a new seine. So the canneries provided that space to work on your seines and to make new seines. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, Nels.
Hey.
Yeah, okay. Lisa, you get the privilege of finishing up for the panel, and then we'll have a short intermission, and then we'll be back for question and answers, and some people from the audience can participate. Lisa?
Well, I was quite young when I started going out there. I don't really know how old I was, and so I had to call my sister up last night to get fill in the blanks. I might have been 5 years old, and I would ride over there on my grandfather's boat, the Neva, and my grandfather was Andrew Hope, and this is my uncle here. And we'd spend the summers out there, and my grandmother worked at the cannery, and my grandfather fished, and my sister was my babysitter. And occasionally my cousin Karen went out there with us, and we lived in this boardwalk community, and we lived in one of the, I don't know if you'd call it a cottage or a cabin, up from the float plane dock, and it was just only had the bare essentials there, and I can remember there was a Ringer washing machine there, and my sister said we didn't have refrigeration. There was a box outside the window that was our refrigerator. I think these girls were our neighbors, probably. And we lived by the float plane dock, so you could watch the action down there. But it was a little bit of a walk down to the cannery. And I was little, so I really wasn't supposed to be down there. That was probably the first time I ate crab, was over there, and my exposure to bears. And I think we rode on the float plane once over there. And I got into my grandma's purse one day and ate her chocolate X-Lax. That's a memory I won't ever forget. And there was a little store down there, and they even had a post office because I'd get an occasional care package down there from my parents, maybe some new sneakers or something. And I'm appreciating learning more about Chatham Cannery because my mother was even born there. So, yeah. Thank you.
Lisa, thank you, and thanks to all the panel members. I want to give a little recap here. We heard detailed descriptions of the cannery operations from Fred. Thanks a lot. We heard a history of pelican and a description of the fish traps by Bill. We also heard about, from Florence, how there was no income tax and no cops and how everyone was real happy. We heard about the Freddy 2 from John and the fishing side of it. We heard about stacking the lids or not stacking the lids. We heard about getting slapped by the fish on the slime line. I have to confess, my first wife, I brought her to Alaska, and they put her to work on the slime line in Kaler Dahl, and that marriage didn't last.
Slave driver.
We heard about the fun and the free times living in the tents without discipline from Nels. And we heard about saving the collars, the best part of the fish to eat. And, of course, then Lisa ended up with her description. Folks, I was born over a bunch of canned salmon in the hospital in Wrangell in 1949, one of the biggest years before we rebuilt these salmon runs in Alaska history, because they had too many cans of salmon to store in a cannery, and they're storing them in the hospital. But I have to say, this description of the Cannery Life, what's happened here so far, has just brought back so many memories. And I'm sure in the second half, as some of you in the audience had your perspective, it's turning out to be a great evening. So right now, we've got some desserts. We're going to take about a 10-minute intermission, and then we'll be back for audience participation.
Yeah, if I get them done here.
Here.
Wander around.
Folks, we have an exciting second half. About 3 or 4 people have approached me that have something to share, and I'm sure some of the rest of you do, and this will be much less formal. People will make a little presentation and then answer questions, and be sure to ask the panel members some questions. And then after we get done with the discussion, one of our panelists has some slides. So we'll end the evening with some slides. I know one of the panelists has to leave at about 8 o'clock, but we'll break it up, and then we can watch some slides, and it looks like there'll be plenty of desserts. Archie Nielsen was one of our panelists and arrived a little late, and so I've asked him to lead off the second section with some of his experiences of the Cannery life.
Thank you, Eric. Can you hear me all right? All right. I'm going to tell you a whole bunch of lies, and believe me, I learned it from my brother over here. Growing up in the Cannery was magical. It was a different way of life. It's not what we wanted. We were siblings of skippers. The families that were left in the Canneries relied on one thing, and that's how to survive every day. Growing up in Chatham, we were too young to do much of anything, so we were the most mischievous people on earth, and I swear, we were mischievous. The Riggin scow had a Chinese cook on there. He had a ponytail way down there. And we studied him for a while. On Wednesdays, he baked pies, and nothing carries further on an inlet that has no wind. That's how Chatham was. There was no wind, but you can smell those pies. So we got together, and he says, well, he puts them outside the rigging scow to cool off. So one of us got the bright idea, we'll pick up one and take off one way, and while he's chasing him, we'll take another one and go the other way. And you could hear this Chinese there, he's just bellowing, and I swear he got his cleaver one time to more or less scare us away. I have to inject, Bill, I agree that everyone talks about the traps, the cancellation of traps. But in the early 50s, a bunch of the skippers got together, especially here in Sitka. Bill Peters, Andrew Hope, my father, Peter Nielsen. The traps decimated the salmon stocks in southeast Alaska. They sprung up after Oregon and Washington decimated the runs down there. Ward's Cove in north of Ketchikan had 27 canneries out of Ward's Cove. It was tremendous. The salmon stocks were dwindling. The wild salmon runs there that normally take place 4 to 6 years. Something had to be done. So the skippers got together and they drew up an initiative to put a halt on the traps. Now this doesn't eliminate the traps altogether. You just put a halt on there. This was in 1952. And you're right. By 1959, the canneries started closing very fast because their main source of income was the canneries and the fish traps. But getting back to Cannery Life, the sisters were saying that bears were not prevalent in Chatham, but they were. They were monitored by the older trinkets that were left in town. They'd go out and they'd actually shoot a bear because a bear, they get more aggressive as they get closer to the canneries. And I remember one weekday that Chinaman, he decided he's going to go out trout fishing in Chatham. They had 1, 2, 3 streams there. He got to the first stream and brought out his fishing pole. About a half an hour later, you could hear that Chinaman hollering. And his short little legs were going for all it was worth. a bear is behind him. His ponytail was straight out. You don't think a short-legged person can move? This guy could move. The Cannery Life in Chatham, like I say, was magical. I think when you talk about the yellow brick road and all the beauty and splendor of this movie, all you had to do was look at one of the Canneries and the life that they built for themselves. We never had cameras. We never had anything to record that. It was only late before we left Chatham for Sitka that they started taking pictures. Cannery Life was tremendous. The ladies, they did their part. They worked 20 hours a day, standing. And you try to stand 16 hours and fatigue sets in. They did this on a daily basis while the fish were running. They relied on breaks. They relied on joking and camaraderie, which we never thought even possible. I myself, I was a former taper painter, and I spent 20 hours a day, and I paid for it. Now I'm paying for it now. But I would like to, my brother and I were trying to remember the tenders that were in Chatham. They were big boats. The A.F. Rich over the top, the Excellence, Caleb Haley, big, beautiful ships. And we had one mailboat, the Esteveth. Big puff of smoke coming out of it. You could see down when you turned the corner. And every Thursday morning, once a week, here comes the Esteveth. So you could see the puff of smoke way out there. I thought the Lacani was slow, but the Esteveth, he had him beat. But that was our supply source for mail, other than the airplanes and staple goods from Sitka or Juneau. But remember one thing, Cannery Life is a different way of life than you and I will even dream about. And it was good. It enriched our lives so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Archie. Before I ask Larry Calvin, who actually owns an old cannery site here in Sitka, I have to confess that I have a Chatham Cannery experience from 1966, 67, the summer of 67. I was sailing on a small wooden sailor, the Velvet, and we pulled into Chatham Cannery. And I wasn't going to mention it, but when Archie mentioned the wonderful pies there, well, they were still present in 1967, and like Archie's, this Norwegian with a sweet tooth figured out that the best pies that I'd ever seen around were the ones that were put out on the coffee break house there in Chatham Cannery. And I also got in trouble for stealing some of the pies from them.
You did.
Anyway, I also have to say that I happen to have an opportunity to travel throughout Southeast Alaska, but the best-looking young women to this 17-year-old boy back then were in Chatham Cannery. Larry Calvin, who owned Pyramid, has some memorabilia and some memories of that, and we'd like to ask Larry to come up and share a little bit of that with us. Larry Calvin.
1962, I was the only charter boat operator in town, a little different than it was now. I was taking a young couple for my little 28-foot boat from here to Juneau. Chatham Cannery was closed at that time, and there was just a watchman and a lady friend. And we wanted to get some gas, so we climbed up the ladder, started walking up the boardwalk there, and here comes this man running down the boardwalk quite fast. And a minute later, a lady came out from one of the shacks behind him. It was mid-afternoon, and I think they had both been drinking just a little bit, because she was shooting a .44 revolver at him as he went down the boardwalk. And these people stood back as well. It's just part of the act that goes on here. I don't know. But anything can happen in Chatham Cannery. But my involvement with the Canneries started pretty moderately early, depending on one's perspective, I guess. That I helped bring the cannery tenders up, the Shamrock and the Clydesdale. And the Shamrock, I just saw it down through the harbor today, and that's an old boat. And the Clydesdale, I'm not sure just what happened, but it was still around. But it was built many years ago as a cannery tender for the pyramid packing. But in that was 1953, that my mom was the bookkeeper, and I was the tally man there at the cannery. And I was a fairly young boy, but my job, as the fish were coming up over this elevator, as somebody was talking about, that I had counters, 4 counters, and I had to decide whether it was a coho, a dog, or humping, or sockeye. And the Filipinos were in back, though. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they were segregating into these bins as the fish came up. So they more or less they would use my count on how much the fisherman was going to get. But what they ended up in the cans. They weren't counted when the bins, but they could tell when I was off. I think only because my mom was bookkeeper and we were friends with Frank Wright that I kept my job. I didn't do a very good job there, but anyhow, that was my first experience of the only experience really working in the cannery. Now, Bob DeArmond, not Bill, but Bob, wrote a very good history of the canneries, and I left 12 of them with Ann back there, detailing through the years, just as Bill described a little bit from the very first cannery. The first 2 canneries in Alaska were out of Sitka and some other place. Kluwak, yeah. And it describes that, but these is real interesting, and in the back of this literature that I left, and talk to Ann. If you want to get some copies, you can talk to Ann, is one of the early pictures of the cannery down there. And one a little later, one is 1920, probably 1919, 1920, and the other is like 1927, 28, and that's in the material back there. Also, for your information, one of the best books that you can get is this, the Silver Years of Alaska canned salmon industry. I highly recommend this. If you really have an interest in the research of the canneries, get this. Call Dee Longendow in Juneau. Have her put you on the list. She got this for us. They're very hard to come by. She has to search for them. But you can get a real good history of the cannery years in this book. So anyhow, that's pretty much, my wife and I bought the cannery premises in 1968 and made a building supply out of it for some years, and now we're back into the fishing industry with processors down there. So the cannery from the early years has continued on now in the fish processing business. I'm working on my boat every day down there. I'm putting new engines in, so if you have a particular interest in any of the history, want to see, I've stored the retorts for the Historical Society. The retort is in the basement of the dock down there, and the iron chinks are in the basement. So if you want to go down the basement, just get down the beach and walk down the beach a little ways, and there's the big retort, and the iron chinks are just out a little bit. You have to get your scuba gear on to see the iron chinks. So anyhow, that's about my history with the fishing industry, Eric.
Thank you, Larry. I passed that one copy around. I'd like to ask Herman Davis.
Sit down.
I'd like to ask Herman Davis to come forward and tell a little bit of his experience. Herman?
Give him 2 minutes.
Cheese. When a cheese, yak al QQ2, the cut you on. Wait a minute, what am I doing?
You have a big finger there now.
Oh, yeah, you think you can get out of here at 8 o'clock? Or 9?
Okay.
You think so?
Yeah. Okay.
Let's see. There's 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. 5, 4, I think you have about 5 hours right here. Well, my experience, she was talking about the Cannery Life a little while ago. I worked up there myself. I started working in the Canneries in 1943, 10 years old. My first job was to push boxes after the canned fish were boxed to where they were going to be stacked. We used to make long trains in them. My friend Joe Howard was working with us too. He was working at the separator, I believe, where the cans go around in circles. And I guess he was kind of daydreaming, and his hand got caught in the machine. Boy, I wanted to cry with my friend there. He was stuck in that machine for over 2.5 hours. They shut the whole can. A lot of accidents happen in canneries, and even on boats. I remember the Flamingo. He had a gas engine aboard. Somehow, I guess a lot of gas leaked into the bilge. And there was a spark. I guess it must have come from the battery. And that boat exploded. It just blew out the sides. And one of the crew members, all he had to do was just roll out of the boat and just fall into the water because the boat was on fire. And the Patricia May hit a rock. One of the crew members was sleeping on the top bunk. Everybody else was just scrambling and trying to save their own lives because they thought the Patricia May was going to go down. And the one that was sleeping on the top bunk, he fell off the bunk, fell right down on the deck, got up, went right back up there, went right back to sleep again. And that is true, he went right back to sleep. My nephew, Leo Houston, almost drowned in the Indian Highlands. The power skip that they were using was too narrow and was too high. By that time we had graduated from the 9-horse Johnson. No, we graduated from pair oars to the 9-horse Johnson to inboards. We had an inboard power skiff. And while they were closing up out of Indian Islands, my brother turned too fast, and the power skiff flipped over. This is how much the people took care of each other. A couple of the boats let go of their sets and sent their power skiffs over to help my father in trying to get his crew back. The first thing my brother did, he yelled, "Never mind me, never mind me. Grab Leo, grab Leo." Leo was only 10 years old. And they grabbed Leo. And I think it was the roundout that came out next to them.
And I figured it was Ernie Jacobs that reached down, far as he could go. My brother was going down already. As far as he could reach, as a matter of fact, I think half of his head is in the water. And he grabbed a hold of his hair and brought my brother back up. So things like that do happen in the sailboats. Here's the other side. Just like Morris said a little while ago, there were no rules. Our parents were working, and there was nobody to watch us, and we could practically do anything we wanted. We found a dead bird one time. A dead bird. We had a funeral for it. No kidding, we had a funeral for the bird. Even some of the girls were crying. So we had a funeral. One of the girls said a prayer. We sang a song, and one of the kids said, "What are you going to do this bird without a coffin?" And one of the kids, I got an idea. Ran home, came back with a matchbox, and we put that bird in the matchbox. And we buried it, and we made a cross for it. He said, "What are you going to write on the cross?" "Oh, no, that's right. It doesn't have a name. What shall we name the bird?" We all thought and thought and thought. Well, let's call it Todd. Okay, boy, that was good because we were in Todd Cannery. Here lies Todd. May he rest in peace. After that, after the funeral, one of the kids ran home and got a can of fruit. And then another kid ran home, came back with pilot bread, crackers, and some butter. And another one came back with just a little bit of Kool-Aid. And we had a reception after the funeral. We did. We had a reception right after the funeral. So just like they said, that cannery was our big playground. A big playground. We used to have play boats on the beach. We used to play with, they used to have a big, 12 by 8 logs for traps. My buddy and I, Russell Rice, we tied two of them together, and we found a wooden box, and we made it into a cabin. And then, about a quarter of the way from the bow, supposed to be the bow of the boat, we put a big nail and we put the rope there. And we made one of the younger boys cook, and another one, the older boy, was the captain, and that was Russell Wright. He was the captain of the boat. And we started pulling that log from off the beach. We had a long rope. Before we knew it, that log was going way out further and further and further. And there was a little bit chop. And I think that chop hit the log just right, and it tipped over. And they were all wading back to the beach, right up to their chest. And one kid said, "I'm going to tell on you guys. I'm going to tell your mother, you guys threw me in the water." Crying. No rules. No rules. We had a lot of fun. Thank you for allowing me to talk. Chichagof Island. Yeah, I think you skipped it, yeah.
Yeah. Hey.
Oh!
I asked Roy Bailey if he'd say a few words on his experiences. Roy?
Go ahead.
I use this one. Thank you, and members of the panel. Can you hear me all right? Talk louder? Okay. Yeah, my experiences of the fishing industry, especially the canneries and the seine boats. But before I get started with that, there was one or two memories that came up as this progressed along. And one of them was, I think I was on the fishing vessel Neva at that time. I was about 13 years old, maybe even 12. But on the Cannery tender, Clydesdale or the Shamrock, one of the crew members on either one of those vessels, I'm not really sure which one, was a young fellow by the name of Calvin. And I don't know just which one that was. But at that time, the reason why I remember that is because the young fellow was awfully sick. He had a summer cold that practically debilitated him. And at that time, he was so sick that he couldn't go to sleep, he couldn't rest, he couldn't do anything. None of the crew could do anything with him. So the cook says, well, I can fix you a medicine that will help you go to sleep. What he did was to get a glass of milk, put an egg in there, raw egg, and a generous portion of whiskey. We didn't see him for the rest of the day after that. The one thing I will comment on too for the refreshments back on the table here, there is one item missing from that table that everyone knew about from way back when, and that is hardtack. You don't see that back there, and that was part of the diet for everybody that was out in the fishing industry. My introduction to canneries came at a very early age. I was on the North Sea going from Sitka to Juneau. I was in between the orphanage and home. But anyway, I was returning to Juneau, and the vessel that I was on was the North Star. I believe it was the North Star. The Northland Transportation Company had that, and the Northland. But the first stop the vessel made was at a place called Port Althorpe.
Port Althorpe, yeah.
And I don't remember if there was a cannery there or not. But
Yep, there was.
I was very, very young at that time, but it fascinated me to see this vessel going in there and getting this huge load of canned salmon. But that was my introduction to what later became known as canneries. Of the canneries that I became acquainted with was Todd Cannery, the very first one, Chatham, Pyramid, and other canneries along the way that you had to be stationed in that port in order to sell your catch to that cannery, and if they would accept it. That is Hood Bay, Hoona, Thunder Bay, is it?
Yeah.
These were also very large canneries at that time. And the one person that I know of that was working at Todd Cannery when it was in full operation is a person by the name of Martha Nelson. She is now 91 years old and just getting over a serious operation. And all she would say was that, yes, I did work at Todd Cannery. My introduction to Todd Cannery was when I was about 6 years old. I had to take care of the younger kids, which was normal for that time. And what we did was to entertain ourselves as the older people are at work. And we would go down to the beach at low tide, bring a bunch of sticks along, build a little fire, dig clams, and have fresh clams roasted in the fire. That was our pastime, and of course a filling one too. Of the fishing part, what isn't mentioned is that those boats that were sailing at that time had old engines in them. They were called either the Atlas Imperial
or the standard, and generally three cylinders. They were huge, and they had a huge flywheel on front of them that rang like a bell. When they went to start those up in the morning, you didn't need an alarm clock. That flywheel would ring like a bell, and then they would turn the flywheel over to get the cylinder in its proper position and pour raw gas into a little cup on top of the cylinders. This was priming the engine. And when all three of the cylinders were primed, they put the switch on and give that big flywheel another heave. When it was running, the people later on called that exhaust rhythm, which is water-cooled exhaust. They said it sounded like potato, potato, potato.
Yeah. It's
Quite,
two-cylinder.
But anyway, that was one of those, and if you didn't watch it, if you didn't stay clear of that exhaust, well, you got kind of gassed. My experiences as on the same boats began when I was about 13 years old. And the reason for that is most all of the high-line crews had their own men picked out right from the very beginning before the season started. But the others that were later on through the season got what was left. I think I was one of the last ones at about 13 years old. But I became quite acquainted with all of the works aboard a boat. And being the youngest one on the crew, I got all the night shift for night runs. Going from here to Chatham, from here to Icy Strait. And I didn't mind that at all. I was learning the country, and at night, on pitch black nights, going up through Chatham, I would sit up on the fly bridge because I could see the mountain outline a little better in the dark. So one night I was going up there, I saw on each side of the vessel 2 huge luminescent streaks that just stayed with the vessel for quite a long while. I don't know what they were, though.
Porpoise.
But it was most fascinating. Many other stories along that line also, getting away from that. Up at Icy Strait was generally the start of the season, so end result was that the seines were new, the seines had been bluestoned, the seines had been tarred. And getting up there into Icy Strait in that very cold water, the tarred seines were like springs when you put them down on deck. They came right back up. So that was part of the break-in of the seines. Of the canneries themselves, the crews inside the cannery are Filipino. And there were very few Chinese at that time. But the machines that replaced the Chinese were what the Americans called iron chink. And as was mentioned here, you can see that's still one of them being left here. Those were quite an interesting machine because they would take a salmon and they would put it in a position whereby the flippers would catch it. It would go through this machine and out the other side would come the fillet of the salmon. The head was gone, the flippers were gone, the fins were gone. It was clean, period. And then it went down through the sliming table. But that machine was so effective and so fast that it filled up the gurry scows in a couple of days. That is when the salmon runs were on. For pastime for the cannery workers themselves, at the beginning of the season, you were not always working. So part of the entertainment was whatever you could find. One of them was fishing, like this Chinaman did back then. And of the ladies, they went out to see if they could find any berries. In that time, it was generally raining quite heavily. So this one lady went out, picked berries, and she thought there was a man over in the next clump of bushes. It wasn't. It was a bear. He was also trying to find berries. But those experiences are those that you never hear unless you ask them. And this is the bear stories that the women would tell, different from the men. Of the fish traps, the last ones I ran into were Salisbury Sound and the one at Point Adolphus up in Icy Straits. Those two were still in operation at that time, and what isn't said is that fish traps were very, very efficient, so much so that they were eventually outlawed. They even caught whales, but the whales in turn demolished the traps, and they had to do a lot of re-rigging on that. Let's see what other notes I got here. Of the company boats, after those big old three-cylinder engines, the high-speed engines came along. You know, those boats in Chatham Cannery, the Exhibit, and those boats were all New England. They were outfitted with an engine called the Hall-Scott. This was a six-cylinder high-speed engine for that day, but that was automotive type. So the end result is you had a big pedal that you stomped down on so that you could shift from forward to reverse or into neutral. A lot of gear grinding there. And then later on, of course, the Chrysler Royal engines came in, and those were, they actually took over then. Of the local cannery, I did work in a local cannery, and I in turn had to train the new people coming in, and part of that was a stapling machine. Once you got to the rhythm of that stapling machine, you could really turn out the boxes. These were cardboard boxes. So all of that had to be done. The two cannery tenders were the Shamrock, which is still here, and the Clydesdale. And I mentioned before that what's missing from the back table is a hardtack, which was a staple all along through history and still is today. Thank you.
Yay. Well, what I'd like to do, we have the panel here, and I'm sure there's a lot of questions out there, other stories. If any of you want to say something or have any questions for the panel here, now's the time. Herbie?
Ready?
We're ready.
Yeah, okay. Everybody's been talking about Chatham Cannery. I'm from Sitka. We fished for Pyramid Packing Company here in Sitka. Lawrence Freeber and Frank Wright were superintendents here at the time. But I started at the cannery at an early age, talking about stitching those boxes. You know, we made thousands of them. A young fellow that's half Filipino, half Hawaiian, kind of took us under his wing, and we were just helping him out. We weren't getting paid, but we did such a good job, he decided, I'm going to go down and get you guys on the payroll. So that's what he did. So for 2 weeks, we got paid, and almost made enough money to buy a bike, but not enough. Anyway, he didn't return the next year, so and the boss knew that we were doing a pretty good job of it, so we had the job of stitching boxes. From there, we graduated. I did anyway. Graduated to be what they call a salter. You had enough salt in the machine, you know, when the fish was going through. So you had to make sure that your container was full of salt all the time. But I remember at that age, we were putting in about 18 hours a day and I kind of fell asleep. And the boss came around and kind of tapped me on the shoulder. You know, he knew I was young, and so he gave me a little tap, told me get on the ball. So I finished off that year as a salter. Then I graduated to be a fish sorter. And that's where, when the fish came up the elevator on a conveyor belt, the fish are going to a bin. So we had a bin here, maybe that was sockeye, a bin here, that is dogs, and we had a lot of humpies, so run down to the last, where they would be stored. So we were busy, and you had to know your fish. Then the next year I was a fish counter. I got down on the boats when the fishermen came in. That is the only time that we counted fish, because when the tenders came in, they were bringing in their own trap fish. So it didn't need to be counted, just needed to be sorted. But there you were. When you're on that fishing boat, you had to know the fish, you know, what they look like. It's kind of tricky when it's early season because everything kind of looks like a king salmon, you know. You don't see the stripes on the hump or the dogs, or humpies don't have a hump. So you had to be pretty sharp. And a lot of times the fishermen would prefer to have their own fish counter, you know. You know you're not going to get because some of the old timers, you know, when the fishermen are pitching fish, they want to get it done. And the counter on the old timer is you might be a little bit slow, you know. So they would ask for certain fish counters to come. But working at Cannery during the years, you know, we were at war, and we put in maybe 18 or 20-hour a day. So I kind of went out on the front of the cannery up in the loft there, getting some fresh air, and then across the island, you know, this was a Navy. Submarines came in, got fueled up, and then they took up right off. They didn't stick around, but it was something to see. We'd never experienced submarines before, so we were more familiar with fishing boats. But a lot of the teenagers in Sitka were very happy when fishing season came around, because a lot of teenagers went to work, and the cannery was full of them. Of course, they had a lot of fun. Even in different canneries, they had, if you were a fisherman, I finally graduated out of that, and I went fishing. But we would visit different canneries on the weekends. They'd have a dance, you know, the Filipino bunkhouse, and the Filipinos playing music. It wasn't like like we'd like, but it is music you could dance to anyway. So many of the canneries had basketball hoops. I was interested in that. Of course, different places that we attended, you know, we'd have a game with one against another boat. So that'd be a lot of activity during the summer. There were times fishing. I think I got on what we call a training ship. I think somebody mentioned there, you don't get too much of a share, you know. I thought I was getting full share. Fished all summer. Check came to $33. But I found out I wasn't getting a full share. But that $33 got me to Sheldon Jackson, and Mr. Yaw's heart. Kind of filled in the rest of my tuition. You know, it was $80 for the year. But in the fall of that year, he got me out of class. Get your fishing gear on. Said, "You going fishing on with Mr. Hope?" Now, the SJ, the second, was built. And that was a brand new, fairly brand new boat. So I got to fish with him for the next 12 years. So I enjoyed my time with him. What a captain he was. Somewhere down the line we had to build a new power skiff. And Mr. Hope was a boat builder. So he said, "Well, we're going in early." So we went and worked in the shop, got the keel laid, ribs made. And then the next trip in, we were going to put fill in the rest of the boat. Almost complete. The power was a 40-horse Jeep, not a marine engine, but it's 40 horse Jeep. And that was pretty good power in those times. And we had the first power skiff here at Sitka, and Mr. Hope built that. Mr. Hope built a lot of the seiners that were built here in Sitka. Sabanus being one. There's a boat from Angoon, along with the SJS the second. And that's probably the last of the boat builders right there. You don't see too many of them around anymore that just go right ahead and build a boat. I think it should be.
Harry Jimmy.
Pardon?
Harry Jimmy.
Yeah, Harry Jimmy owns it now. Yeah, but I think we should make that a historical site. My feelings on it. But I hope that we cover a little bit of seining in Sitka. Thank you.
Yay. Well, it's amazing how the stories have filled in so much of the history. I had some experience sailing too. I was an assistant skiff man for 7 years. That's probably some kind of record. That's the guy who doesn't run the skiff. That's the guy who throws the lead out of the bow of the skiff. Apparently there was some feeling that it was better to have me out in the bow of the skiff than on the boat entertaining the rest of the crew with various stories. So,
Caught by Alaska fishermen. I like clams and shellfish. They sure make a swell dish, but I think your hand-packed crabs are grand. I don't like T-bone steak caught from the steer in Texas, but give me fish, and I don't care if I do pay taxes. I like humpback salmon, good old humpback salmon, caught by Alaska fishermen. Okay, let's sing now.
She's going to sing it first so you get the tune. Okay, ready?
I like humpback salmon, good old humpback salmon, caught by Alaska fishermen. I like clams and shellfish. They sure make a swell dish, but I think your hand-packed crabs are grand. I don't like T-bone steak caught from the steer in Texas, but salmon, good old humpback salmon, caught by Alaska fishermen.
Thank you, Mary Todd. Fred?
There's a couple of points that I feel that should be mentioned before we come to a close, and that one of them is a description of a salmon trap. And basically what it is first you have to know that in Chatham Straits or any place where there's open water, you have salmon that are traveling along the shoreline. And what a salmon trap is a big fence. And the fence is put against their path. And it's connected to the shoreline. And those fish run into that fence, and then they lead out into the corral, where they're corralled. And eventually, there's several pots in there that fill up. And there's a watchman aboard, and he has a radio, and he calls the cannery and he says, "My trap is full, send a tender." And that's the other thing I want to get to. We have a very passionate feeling about our boats. We always talk about our boats, and high up on the list is our tenders. Now, I've talked to Herbie Didrikson and I have talked to Herman Davis about some of the tenders that we know of. And these tenders were bigger boats. The majority of your seine boats were 40 to 50 feet long, and the tenders were anywhere from 60 to 70 feet long. And what they did was they collected the fish out in the fishing grounds, and they brought it back to the cannery. But we have all these fascinating names, and what I want to do sometime in the future is go over the whole list of names of boats that we all know about. But just right off the bat, I can tell you what we had in New England, which is Chatham Cannery. We had Over the Top and the Quaker Maid, Neptune, Macaca, Burl E., Caleb Haley, and then in Todd you had the Equator and the Paradise and the Pirate. Now to me, I always loved those odd names that they had. Somebody had requested that boat be built, and then they named it. And it's always a fascinating name. Thank you.
We have somebody who wants to come on the back. We're going to have to wrap this up, folks. We're using up all our time, but we'll have a couple more stories. I just want to say the names of the boats are famous. One of the famous boats in southeast seining had a kind of strange name, the Tiny Boy Second, out of Wrangell. Great. And then, of course, the Janice M. out of Craig. Great boats. And, of course, the Vagabond Queen out of Hoona. I don't know you, but go ahead.
I don't know you either, but my name is Pat Svetlak, not Affleck, Svetlak. But I was born and raised in Petersburg, but I grew up in the Cannery Life. We lived in Cape for a while, and my dad was a fisherman, and he was a very good fisherman. He made lots of money. So we built a new home in Cake. And my mother worked in a cannery, which was a mile out of town in Cake. And our house, brand new house, caught on fire. And I was just a little girl. My sister was babysitting me, and she brought me out, but I ran back in for my favorite doll. And some guy came in, ran down the beach, put a blanket over, went wet the blanket, put it over him, and I was scared of him. I ran and hid underneath my mom and dad's bed. And then later on, I was on the boat with my mom and dad. As a little girl, my dad always had to anchor up when I could eat, so I could eat. And anyway, he anchored up, and I had a line with a hook and sinker, and I threw it overboard, and I was jigging for halibut. All of a sudden, the line went bzzz. I wrapped it around the pole, pulled on it. It took me a long time. I stepped on the line, pulled again, and that fish didn't even fight. He came up to the top. That fish was over 100 pounds. And I was screaming and yelling, "Dad, Dad!" He thought I fell overboard. And he came up on deck, and all I could do was, you know. And after our house burned, we moved to Petersburg and bought a house there. So that's where I was born and raised. And the only reason why we moved to Petersburg, because there was no high school in Cape at the time. My sister was in high school. And when I was around 10 or 12 years old, after school, I would change my school clothes and help my mother pick shrimp. And I was always glad when Sunday came, because there was no work. But then I name-it it in the cannery. I gutted fish, slimed fish, and I worked on the egg belt, pulled eggs. I worked up in the loft. I made boxes. And one time as I was gutting the salmon, pulling out the guts, something fell, and it was a capsule. And inside the capsule said, I forgot the little boy's name. My name is, and I'm 11 years old. Whoever finds this, please write to me. Here's my address. So I wrote to him, and he sent me a picture of him in his baseball uniform. And I believe I still have that card. And working in a cold storage was long and hard hours. I worked from till 3 o'clock in the morning, and then I would have to go back if I wanted to, at 7 or 8. And those were long, hard hours. Wintertime, I worked on crab. And in order to bring the crab, the guys would bring the crab in, through the door. And every time they opened the door, the snow was just like a blizzard. Cold. Really cold. And Cannery Life was also fun. And I worked on halibut with over 300 pounds, and they had put a tiny little Korean girl on the line. And I went to the boss. I said, "Why did you put her on the line?" The halibut was over 300 pounds. And as the fish were going down the line, she took one, and she yelled, "Pat, Pat, help me!" And that great big fish just fell on the floor, and then the boss moved her. But there's a lot of things, good things and bad things. Like somebody said, my cousin's husband had gotten his finger chopped off. And so what they did, they got ice and medevaced him here to Monitchcombe. But all in all, I did enjoy the Cannery life, even as many hours that I've worked. And needless to say, I'm retired now. And while I was working in the coal storage, I had met a man there that was in the Coast Guard, and he took me away from the Cannery life, and here we are.
Folks, wait, I'm sure there are more stories, and our appetites are whetted, but we have run out of time. I need to ask Rebecca Paulson to come up here and do some thank yous for everybody who's helped put this together. I see Ann Polnow is coming up instead. I want to thank the panelists. We'd envisioned more question and answer. Of course, what happened is everybody had stories to tell, and you guys on the panel set the tone for that. And we have to leave at 9 o'clock, or we may not be able to use this facility again. But Ann has some thank yous that she wants to express on behalf of the society.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And thank you, Eric. You did a wonderful job keeping it all together, keeping the program going. And I think we did open a can, and it wasn't salmon, it was worms. And just I called a few people, and it kept growing and growing. And I didn't mean to exclude anyone from the audience and their experiences. And I think what we're going to have to do, John Nielsen here, Big John, has several magazines of slides, and many of these slides are from the 50s, your father's slides.
Next time.
What I think we're might do is call this Cannery Life Part 1, and then have a Part 2, and it could be Part 10 someday. But this is what our goal is as the Maritime Society, is to do this, and hopefully by Part 3 maybe we'll be at the boathouse, and with all your support, it's great, and we love your interest and the participation, and I'm envious of the Cannery life. It sounds fun, and just all the pictures and the research that I did in 2 weeks, I've learned so much, and it's been great. And there's people from the Filipino community that couldn't be here tonight. This woman came over to work in the cannery, and part whatever, she can be here too. So thank you, everyone, for coming. We really appreciate it.